Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Yoon Jung Park, and I am the Program Director of the Africa-China Center at FS at Georgetown University. Welcome, everyone, to this webinar. The webinar
Hello, everyone.
is playfully entitled Playing Both Sides or Being Played, Africa and China, US Tech Wars. And we're gonna run this session as a roundtable. Let me go ahead and introduce our roundtable participants and our moderator, and then I'll hand it over from there. The only piece of housekeeping I wanted to share with you is that if, as you're listening, something perks your interest, please feel free to add your comments or questions using the Q&A box in your Zoom. I'm going to start my introductions with Professor Seyram Avlay. Seyram is Associate Professor in the Department of Communications at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Mandra Bhagwandeen is lecturer, recently starting at the Department of Political Science at the University of Stellenbosch in South Africa. We have with us as well someone from down the road, Henry Tugendhat. He is an economist on the China team at the U.S. Institute of Peace. And our final panelist is Bob Wekesa, who is the director of the African Center for the Study of the U.S. at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. Our moderator today is my colleague, Professor Ken Apollo. He's Associate Professor in African Studies and Political Science at the George Walsh School for Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Thank you all for being here, and let me go ahead and turn it over to Ken.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. Great to meet our esteemed panelists again for some of you, and looking forward to a conversation today. I'll perhaps start with Professor Avlay. Am I saying that correctly? Yes. So, could you give us just a brief overview of, what might an African-centered view of our discussion today look like? The US-China tech war, China in Africa, the US in Africa, several other US allies in Africa. What does that look like from the African perspective?
Thank you, Professor Opalo. And it's good I can't really see people, but whoever is out here, thank you for joining us. I think an African-centered view is at the very least, positioning African interests, African lives, livelihoods at the center of any conversation, right? So we begin with less about, the conflicts or the tensions between two parties, but saying, well, what does it look like for Africans to be sort of their daily lives be sort of surrounded by technology created by Chinese and American corporations, right? So centering African lives is sort of the way that I like to think of this. And so, for instance, for the last few months, I've been working on a project that's really interested in looking at the socio-technical practices around consumer technologies and digital consumer technologies in Africa. So smartphones, smart television, smart watches, the things that many Africans are thinking of as aspirational or moving into the middle class. So where are those things coming from? And they're coming from both China and the US, right? So you have, very affordable smartphones coming from a company like Transsion, which most of us here know about, that makes Tecno, Infinix, and so on and so forth. There are even others like XTG that are, smaller, but also quite affordable for people on the lower end of the economic rank, and then this Huawei and et cetera, right? But all of these run on Android, which is owned by Google. And a lot of the digital apps that they use are moderated and policed by the Google Play Store. And so when we're doing projects in places like Nigeria and Kenya, and finding out that there are microfinance loans that are extracting all kinds of things from African consumers or holding their personal data as collateral. Where is that really coming from, right? So the question is, really for me, positioning an African life at the center is who is being harmed by the economic activities or technological activities between these two regions, and how might we protect African data, African citizens in this kind of context, right? So that's just the beginning point for me, is like, let's situate African context, interest, lives at the center, and then work around, well, where's, are there harms being perpetuated, whether it's through people's datafication or, are they getting benefits, right? It's not always negative, but beginning with the Africans at the center and then trying to figure out where these things are coming from. Of course, eventually it leads us to these two giants, if you will, but when we begin there, we might see different kinds of harms, right, than if you begin the conversation by starting at the macro level or thinking through trade policies, right? The harms perpetuated through, say, microloans and using personal data for collateral might become invisibilized if you don't start from an African perspective, or the youth, or African citizens, African consumer perspective. So that's what I think that that's how I've been framing this kind of conversation on my end.
Great opening. I think which places this discussion squarely where it should be. And so, Dr. Wekesa, a quick question for you in reaction to the points made here. To what extent do African governments sort of understand this from the sort of the African consumer perspective? Or, should we understand their position as being, caught in between the two competing powers? Or should we view them as having their feet squarely on the ground and understanding that this should be an African-centered sort of policy approach and response, even as they're handling the competition between the US and China? I'll come back to you in a bit, Dr. Wekesa.
Thank you.
Yeah, just I'll come back to you in a minute. Mandira, I think I guess related to this question, there's also the question of African governments and their thoughts on digital sovereignty, how to define it, how they actually implement it policy-wise. How do you see digital sovereignty and how to define it, and perhaps how you imagine African governments should pursue this in the context of using technology from elsewhere?
Okay, thanks for the question. It's definitely an interesting one, and one that is quite conceptual and theoretical. So I'm going to try avoid going too deep into the more conceptual heavy kind of answer, but I think it is still necessary to just touch a bit on the conceptual making, so to speak, of digital sovereignty. And I think I think the best way to understand it or describe it, even define it, is the state's ability to exercise control and authority over virtually everything that has to do with ICT, right? So that's from data, software, standard protocols, hardware, processes, services, and infrastructure. And this in turn enables the state to exercise control and authority over its citizens' cyberspace activities and access to technologies. And of course, this means that in a way, traditional state sovereignty and digital sovereignty are interconnected. For example, if you take one of the principles of state sovereignty, it's the state's, one of them is the state's ability to exercise power and control over resources and people in a demarcated area. And this extends into the digital realm, where we see that states are trying to ensure laws are obeyed in cyberspace and kind of limit the influence of external actors. And this includes the market dominance by foreign companies, and the impact on domestic issues. So I think, you know, the approach, they kind of, especially when we look at the US and China, they kind of they're practicing two different types of digital sovereignty. There's the more state-centered approach by the Chinese, you know, where the government controls and censors the internet and has strict data laws. So, for example, foreign companies that are operating in China and all the data they accrue in China has to be stored within the country, within its servers. So that gives the government access and control to the data. And the Chinese argue that they take this approach to maintain social stability and national security. And then, you know, some would say the US takes a less interventionist, more laissez-faire approach to digital sovereignty. I think Sarah might be able to add or correct me if she'd like. And, you know, that's typified by kind of these priorities, US priorities to ensure the free flow of data and promote digital trade and services. And this was expressed, you know, when Obama was in the White House. He said something along the lines of the US's need to prioritize an open, free, global, I think I quote here, interoperable, reliable, and secure internet. So the US is more kind of hands-off approach, is what we kind of term a digital democracy, and the kind of the Chinese more interventionist, state-centered approach is what we commonly term as a digital authoritarian. So when we look at, you know, how Africa, how digital sovereignty is manifesting in Africa, you know, how are African governments, societies conceptualizing digital sovereignty? I think from some of the research I've undertaken, it seems to be that African governments seem, or I don't want to just, I don't want to try and generalize, but let's just say in some cases, so to speak, African governments typically frame digital sovereignty as an extension of national sovereignty. And some scholars argue that many African governments' understanding of the concept appears to be influenced or shaped or in some way molded on the Chinese understanding of the concept. So we have, as you know, the continent's very large, very diverse, 54 African countries. We have digital regulations and laws that have emerged in the last few years. It's not as many as we'd like to see, but the idea is gaining momentum. And over the last years, we've seen, you know, quite a few data policies or laws and regulations at both the continental AU level as well as more national level, countries like Rwanda coming out with data laws and things. And what's been drawn from this is that many of these laws and regulations emphasize self-determination through local ownership and control of locally produced data. So, and what we're seeing, I think, and what I've kind of gathered from the research is that in line with this more kind of state-centered approach to digital sovereignty and this growing concern with digital sovereignty in the region, African countries are, you know, taking on projects to build massive data centers to ensure that their data can be stored in country and provide the state with easier access to it. Most of our data is routed through the US and Europe, and so by hosting our data or routing our data outside of our borders, you know, some argue that we're ceding some of our political, economic, and digital sovereignty.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you very much for that. And so, Bob, I guess this is still a great time for you to come in and sort of give us how African governments are actually balancing, you know, these competing objectives of, you know, obviously allowing their societies to benefit from access to technology, but also being concerned about social control and potential harms from the outside, and at the same time balancing competing asks from the US and China. What's sort of that high level view from your perspective on government policy and government reactions?
Thanks, Ken, and thanks, colleagues, for your input up to this point. I think I'll start off by saying, you know, in response to the question, in fact, the title of today's discussion is quite germane, you know, playing both sides of being played. And I think that then suggests, as my colleague Mandira has pointed out, there are key major pillars here. And these pillars are based on geopolitics and geostrategy. I think all of us have been aware for at least 2 decades or plus now of the notions of a rising China and a declining US or declining you know, West more broadly. I think in the past, this used to be more in the economic sphere, in infrastructure more broadly, but increasingly it has entered the digital tech, internet, and information and communication technology sphere. And it's almost like a repeat of the Cold War period, where African countries, I think the famous saying is that when 2 elephants fight, the grass suffers. It's almost as if we are back in that era, but this time around, in rapidly developing and dynamic, you know, technologies. I think what African countries have therefore adopted, in my view, is indeed playing both sides to win, but also being played. I think if you look at the playing both sides to win, I'll give you the example of the Lobito Corridor project, which runs from the port of Lobito in Angola on the Atlantic, up north to the DRC with the Segyu into Zambia. It has been developed with the leadership of the US, but also bringing in the other G7 partners and a number of financial institutions. A kind of a different model, but it is seen as a project that is going to benefit those 3 countries and other African countries more broadly, because they are these critical minerals that are, you know, critical for development of things such as electric vehicle batteries and so forth. And so you see Angola, Zambia, and DRC in a relationship with the US in this instance. But at the same time, the Chinese have also been involved in mineral exploration and exportation. You know, copper in Zambia, you know, and things like coltan, lithium, and so forth in Angola and DRC. So it will look like African countries in this particular instance are ready and happy to play both sides, to say we can deal with you and deal with the other. The challenge comes in when there are ideological suppositions, ideological principles in which one partner, the US, says the internet, for example, should operate in a free and open manner, while the other partner says internet sovereignty, for example, suggests that you can decide what to do with the internet. And in this case, the Chinese will be very clear and say, as they have done with the Great Wall of China, where you can't access Google or Gmail and so forth for many years now, that we decide what we do. And so I think African countries have therefore you know, chosen to go with what each partner is providing. And I think, as some colleagues have already suggested, in terms of public goods like internet infrastructure and so forth, it looks like the digital eyes, if you wish, are more towards Beijing, because that's where you can get 5G technologies, cheap phones. You know, you can also start imagining things in the AI space and so forth, rather than the US side, which is corporate-led, a liberal model where you have tech companies that are more focused on profits rather than, say, doing, developing digital technologies on the continent as a public good. And I think I'll end this particular intervention by saying we are all focused on the forthcoming FOCAC, FOCAC 9. And I think this is where the African, governments will have done well to come up to negotiate certain positions that will help them grow the digital space. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bob. And I think it's all very interesting to see the ways in which African governments are succeeding or failing at playing both sides. And we'll come back to questions about security and surveillance within a number of African countries in a moment. Okay, Henry, China has been mentioned several times on the panel so far. There's often this sense that China is everywhere, doing everything, both because of just the sheer ubiquity of Chinese products, right? Technophones are everywhere, and they're getting better and better. So they're no longer the phone for the poor, as it were. Could you just give us a lay of the land? What's the scale of Chinese data centers? What's the scale of Chinese sort of cloud technology in the region, so that we can calibrate our understanding of China's involvement in the digital space in Africa?
Sure. Thanks, Ken. And thank you so much for having me on this very august panel. It's a real pleasure to be with you all in this very engaging conversation. I think this question really goes to which sector you're looking at. And so, as alluded to, I mean, there are several sectors at play here, right, that all matter for digital sovereignty, that all matter for digital development or economic development, and different Chinese companies play in different markets. The one big exception is obviously Huawei, who we hear so much about. And I think what is so unique about Huawei in the landscape of Chinese tech firms is that it competes across so many different sectors. So it's competing with Nokia and Ericsson for carrier mobile technologies. It's competing with Google and Alibaba and Tencent and AWS and Asia, Microsoft Asia for cloud service providers. It's competing with Transsion and Nokia, less Nokia these days, but Transsion and Motorola, for example, and Samsung for mobile handsets. So I think it's really important to disaggregate the sectors that we're looking at, because there is a different answer depending on the sector that we're looking at. So there are some sectors where Chinese tech firms are dominating, and there are others where they are perhaps catching up. For example, Cisco versus Huawei. Cisco is still very dominant versus Huawei across Africa. But since you flagged data centers, and since we're talking about digital sovereignty, I think this is a really, really interesting sector to focus on, because I think it is actually very unexpected that Huawei is doing as well as it is doing in Africa. Huawei came to the cloud service provider game very late. It only started working in cloud service provider space in 2017. By comparison, most of its competitors like Tencent, AWS, Microsoft Asia, Google, they all started in before 2010, basically. Still to this day, if you look at world market share, Huawei takes up less than 2% of the world market share of cloud service providers. It was even overtaken by Salesforce since it started operating in this space. It's not a big player, especially in China. It's not a big player. Alibaba is much bigger. So is Tencent. In Southeast Asia, Alibaba and Tencent are much bigger. But when it comes to Africa, Huawei has really thrown the kitchen sink at this market and seems to be coming out on top by certain measures. And what I don't want to get into too technical details here, but in terms of the infrastructure that the servers that it has in certain third-party co-location centers, presumably the types of co-location centers that Mandira was referring to, the African companies who build data centers. Huawei hosts several servers in some of these centers to sell to local markets. and it seems to be, based on the data that I've been gathering on this research question, it seems to be installing more of this infrastructure than others to sell to local markets. It is also selling more to private buyers, namely governments. And this is something that I found very interesting over the course of interviews so far, that effectively Huawei seems to be leveraging the language of digital sovereignty to sell its data centers to African governments. But I think there's a very important distinction to be made between digital sovereignty and cyber sovereignty, or cybersecurity rather. And what I mean by that is you can sell a privately owned data center, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the data stays there, right? You may still need, power can go down in a country. You can get bugs, you can get faults, you can get, lose connections of the actual cables. And so what will often happen is servers will back up across different state borders. And what you have in particular with a company like Huawei is they will make a lot of money selling what are called managed services contracts, which means that they will sell you the data center, they will sell you the equipment, and then they will also sell you a contract for, say, 3 years, where they will say, if there is any problem with this technology, our technicians will come in and fix it. And they may, set up a secure link to Shenzhen to fix that problem. And so I think this is something that's often overlooked in the very good marketing of Huawei's data centers in Senegal and DRC and Kenya, that actually these are not, in the speak of the sector, air-gapped. If you want to sell a data center to a government, like AWS sold a data center to the UK government a few years ago, these typically cost billions and billions of dollars if you're going to make it truly, truly secure. Huawei is not selling that kind of technology. What it is selling is effectively its servers, and saying that because you own them and because they are on your state, within your state borders, therefore that is digital sovereignty. So I think we need to be clear what the difference is between digital sovereignty and actual cybersecurity, because if the data is still going across borders, then that's not necessarily digital sovereignty, as I think Mandira was laying out. But just to wrap up, I think the last thing that I find really interesting about this sector is that Huawei has also been benefiting a lot from Chinese lending to build some of these data centers in Africa, and I think that has helped the advancement of its brand. And I think it's particularly interesting when you compare that with Alibaba and Tencent, who haven't received any funding from the Chinese government, and in fact have been clamped down upon within China's domestic market. These are also companies that are described as foreign firms within China's sort of national policy literature, because they're registered in the Cayman Islands. And so I think it paints a really interesting picture of who the Chinese government wants to succeed in foreign markets, and how they go about that, basically. I'll stop there for now.
Yeah, so thank you for that overview. And Mandira, just on a quick question regarding Huawei's success in sort of establishing links with African governments, but also building servers. Is it to what extent, as Henry has hinted, is this a direct result of Beijing leaning on African governments and perhaps providing lending, and vis-a-vis, say, just market forces, right? Nobody else perhaps is willing to even countenance entering the African market, and then Huawei comes along with cheaper sort of products that African governments can rely on. What's the balance there between market dynamics of a player that perhaps has a higher risk appetite than most moving into African markets versus the role of the Chinese government in helping it along?
Thanks for that. I don't know why my camera just switched off by itself. Okay, it's back on. Yeah, I think that, you know, there's been a lot of reports and research linking, you know, Huawei to the Chinese government through people, its officials and former Chinese officials Chinese government officials that are in Huawei. So I think a lot of it is government to government kind of talks and dealings and agreements. It helps that, you know, China has quite a lot of, I'd say, respectable, or I'd say stable ties with many African governments. It's often the preferred partner for development projects. One being because it doesn't take this kind of lecturing disposition that African countries and African people don't like to get from the West. Two being, you know, it does kind of tailor its products, or, you know, kind of try and meet the customer's pocket, you know, what the customer can afford. It's open to negotiating around building infrastructure projects that you know, African governments feel they can afford. Three, I think, is you know, in terms of risk, it helps that there's kind of support from the Chinese government. There are some risky markets. I mean, many African countries' basic infrastructure like electricity that you need for these data centers and stuff is lacking, or not as stable. So it is a risky investment. I mean, you know, if you build a data center and you don't have a constant electricity supply, you know, it's not going to function properly. So there is a risk involved, and it helps that in some countries, you know, the Chinese are involved in other infrastructure projects that could tie to the success of a data center being successfully built and managed and operated afterwards. And I think, again, also the kind of management contracts that Henry was speaking about helps, because it creates this kind of one-stop shop model that I kind of tell my students about. Is, you know, you can get loans from China, you can get contractors to build the infrastructure, and you can get poster construction if your country does not have citizens with the skills to manage or run the project. China provides, like, as Henry was saying, these management kind of contracts or post-construction kind of maintenance or running operations to just help with getting the project off the ground, starting it up, and then training people as well to manage it. So the kind of this one-stop shop model is quite appealing, because it means you're dealing with one kind of entity, and so, as opposed to multiple entities that can create quite a complexity around, you know, project management and things. So I think it's a combination of government to government dealings. The model of kind of project development is appealing. I think, yeah, market forces, I'm you know, pretty, especially looking at Huawei in the data center space. I think it's pretty much not playing a very big role, given the dominance of Huawei in the data center space, and the fact that it's even looking to grow further and build more data center projects. So I think it's more kind of you know, behind the scenes, closed doors kind of negotiations and dealings.
Thank you for that, and we'll come back to, you know, the question of, you know, what non-Chinese funds are or even can do to compete in African markets. But so Sarah, you know, as we think about, you know, data centers and the services that are provided using access to said data centers. And of course, the fear or reality of China always having a backdoor to the data centers, even if they're domiciled in African countries. Does this matter to the average consumer? Say all you want to do is, you need the cloud service, end of story. You're not trying to overthrow Kagame or the Kenyan government, right? Does it matter to you? What's the perspective on all of this from the consumer's sort of standpoint?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I put this very question to a number of young Ghanaians. I did a focus group on the university campus towards the end of last year and asked them about, do you care about, your data? And this is a question I asked my American students in my classes as well. And it's really fascinating to hear the African students and specifically Ghanaian students say yes and no, right? On the one hand, I am aware that I am giving data to various entities on a daily basis, but it's so overwhelming to read through agreements and terms and conditions. And so, of course, I kind of breeze through and then I kind of push it to the back of my mind until something comes up, until there is a problem, right? And on most days, there's no problem. And it really depends on the consumer. So, of course, there's, and I think this is really important to underscore, that there are a class of consumers that are very much skilled and informed about their digital practices, right? And then I would say the majority, if we're talking about young people, in the US, they're like, well, it's a system that's too big for me to care about, and I'm not doing anything bad, so I don't care that I'm being surveilled, right? So there are various attitudes, but I find that the African students I spoke to were kind of a little bit more in tune, in part because they felt that a lot of their data was being processed or being pulled by entities that are not native to their countries, right? And so they're sensitive to foreign influence in that way. And it's a really interesting way to talk about that. But you might think, oh, okay, you're talking to middle-class people, university educated people. This kind of finding also, kind of shows up when you talk to folks about, especially in fintech, especially, and this has happened, and I mentioned this kind of like, weaponizing data for collateral. So just to give what I'm talking about here is, and this has happened in Ghana, Nigeria, and Kenya. And once in a while, the governments in those places will step in. So micro-lending or financial institutions would give small loans to, whether it's market women, it doesn't really matter who the client is. It's just small amounts of money that you can, and if you're a market person, you might sort of borrow in the morning and then go sell and then come and pay it back, right? It depends on what the modality it is, but it's quite a common practice to borrow money and then pay it back, and very small amounts of money and pay a little bit of interest. And so at some point, I think I want to say in 2022, it became quite common that due to a number of different things, and one of the things that this project that I did with Internews found was that some consumers suspected that companies were intentionally making them default so that they would then try to institute a different kind of data collection practice. But at this point, that's speculation. But essentially, there's this practice of, well, if you default on the loan, it turns out that in your agreement to take that loan, you had said that you're given access to your address book and contacts. And so one of the more punitive and more pernicious practices was to then send messages to people on your contact list that you are a bad person of bad character, you don't know how to pay your loans, so on and so forth. And this has shown up in different African countries, right? And so that practice, of course, people then, this is slander, right? You're attacking people's percent. So all this to say that, the sensitivity to what happens to people's data is not restricted to middle-class university, students. It's people all over, because they are aware that they're given information that harms their social positioning and affects their daily livelihoods and so on and so forth. So yes, consumers broadly care about what happens to their data. And in the instances I mentioned, lots of complaints to government entities to step in and do something, right? And sometimes African governments are able to do this. And I've seen this in the different countries where it's, they try and locate a physical office for the financial institution making these loans. Often they are not, because they are in the cloud, and shutting them down. And then, you can look at other places where this comes is through sort of like the Google Play Store, where the kind of standards that allow these applications to make it to the consumer are not as well. If you wanted to use a comparative, Apple Store, for instance, right? The checks and balances there are slightly different, but you get different levels of access. So different entities can produce apps and put them in the Play Store. They can't do it in the Apple Store, and you have all kinds of challenges with that. But what it means is that there are more actors in the digital space that have more access to African consumers, meaning different levels of difficulties in protecting African citizens and their data, right? So on the consumer end, there are several complications. And then, of course, you have to go to the back end of the data. Where is it being stored? And the questions and the conversations that we've been having with Mandira and Henry, which, and just a point on that, this notion of, storing data on sort of stateside, if you will, within your borders, doesn't guarantee protection of citizens either, right? You have to kind of trust the government that is in power to not weaponize it against its own people, which in pretty much every case, including the US and China and African states, governments do this, right? So it's not just that African governments are untrustworthy, it's that there is a delicate balance between state control, private entities, and access to infrastructure and data and data, if you will, and consumer protections. And there is a role for civil society, there's a role for academia. So I really think of what we're talking about as like a very multifaceted, multi-stakeholder space where we should not leave certain decisions to just the state or to just big tech or just commercial entities to figure it out and leave consumers out, because consumers have a say. They care about it more than we think, and would like feedback. And so in my sort of conversation with the Ghanaian student, there was a desire for sort of resources from academia and civil society to provide ways that they can work around having a little bit of control of where their data goes and what people do with it. And there's a desire for that. And the Data Protection Agency in Ghana, for instance, may play a role, but I see a space for us academics sort of collaborating in different ways to also provide tools that can act as checks and balances, because again, it's multifaceted in many ways. But long answer to the question, but yes, consumers are acutely aware and care about these, and it behooves all of us to kind of be more actively involved in not just talking about it, but kind of figuring out ways that we might protect African consumers.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point regarding, the view from the consumer perspective, because I think often, right, the high level politics and geopolitics abstracts away from the demand side, right? African governments will not stop working with Huawei if they can't find alternative farms to help them. That's one sort of strand. The other strand that kind of complicates this a little bit, of course, is that all of this runs on Google's marketplace platform, Android. Also, lots of American firms are actually involved in the fintech sort of cases that you describe, right? Which raises the question of, if it's a question of, data protection, perhaps the US should also care about what, Silicon Valley-based firms are doing in terms of data protection for consumers. Which takes me back to this question about, the role of Western firms, the US, but also European firms in the African space. And, both Henry and Mandira can speak to this. To what extent have non-Chinese firms tried to enter the African market? Cisco was mentioned. Who are the others? Why haven't they, or why aren't they succeeding? And for the ones that have, to what extent, do they lean on their home governments to help them succeed? Or do they, go out and try their luck and only run to the governments if need be? In other words, is there a sort of a commensurate government effort, perhaps through embassies and other entities, to help Western firms make their way into African markets? I'll start with you, Henry.
Sure. Yeah. I really like this question because I think this has so much to do with what's going on in African markets right now. Especially if we just focus on data centers. I mean, there is huge demand for cloud services in Africa right now, and you've got all of these company reports talking about a gold rush, and there are very good reasons for that, right? If you have like the traditional model of data management is this, that you just manage a server in your own building, right? Like, so you've got, you know, every country in Africa has a national bank. Every country in Africa has the offices of an airline, or, you know, probably the offices of Uber or whatever, an auditing firm or anything, you know, everybody needs data services. And so the traditional model of managing that in-house means that you have to have your own technicians, you have to have your own stable power supply, and you have to be able to keep it cool, basically. And that's very expensive. And so the opportunity of having Chinese firms or US firms come in and provide these third-party services, it means that people can save costs and effectively, as Mandira was saying, you know, lean on the expertise of people who bring in these when you've got perhaps a lower talent pool in some countries. And the reason, by the way, sorry, I focus on China and the US, is that unfortunately that's the world we live in right now with data services. Like, those are the only two countries that are really selling this internationally. Like, you've got a little bit from Germany, but that's the only alternative right now. So to what extent do they come in? Well, the problem is the supply is not meeting the demand, partly because of compliance. So we've been talking about digital sovereignty, data sovereignty. Rightfully, African countries are very concerned about what happens to their data, and they have become increasingly interested in adopting GDPR, the legislation in Europe. And I think a lot of Americans and a lot of Chinese don't understand that a lot of Africans really don't like the fact that China and the US have national security laws that allow them to access data from overseas for their own national security interests. Europe, because I think precisely because it doesn't really have any market leaders in this space, has developed a very aggressive form of legislation to protect citizens' data. And I think that's what's so appealing to African counterparts. However, the problem for now is that most African countries have their own totally unique data sovereignty rules and laws. And this means that if Amazon or Huawei or Alibaba, whoever wants to really set up in Chad or DRC, then they really have to meet and sell to local customers, right? Sell to local businesses and private citizens. Then they have to meet those data sovereignty laws. And for most of them, it's just the bar is too high to be worth them making those investments. And so, you know, I was talking about Huawei getting loans, but Huawei is unique in the landscape of cloud service providers, because when I was doing interviews in Johannesburg and with Nigerian engineers about this, who work in the main cloud service providers, they were saying, yeah, no, Alibaba, Tencent, AWS, Microsoft Asia, these guys, we all compete for like private sector business, for corporate clients, you know, the Air Kenyas, the national banks, that sort of thing. Huawei is not very competitive in this space because it's new. It doesn't have a very good product in cloud services yet. And so that's why it's been leaning more on its reputation, according to these people in the sector, to sell directly to government buyers, which the other companies have not really been doing so much of. And so you don't need compliance for that, really. If you're just selling to the government, you're selling a packaged piece. You don't, it's not like you're looking to measure the compliance across all of these, all of your various customers. And so I think there's a real opportunity for these movements towards regional or even continental digital sovereignty legislation, so that if you can set a standard that everybody can comply with, you only need one team of lawyers to comply with the East African or the whole of African digital legislation, then that'll make it a lot more appealing for international cloud service providers to come in and meet the demand that there currently is. But I think there's currently a real gap, and I think it's a real problem for African economies who genuinely need this data, but obviously need it in a safe and secure way.
Thank you. Indira, over to you on the same.
Yeah, I think Henry's pretty much, provided quite a comprehensive answer. I think looking at it, there's quite a kind of mosaic of influences and kind of, I think, service providers that we need to navigate. So we're looking at, in terms of our data regulations and laws, we are mainly, or most African countries are drawing on best practices. That is the Europe's GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation. In terms of software, we still use a lot of US software, or I think everybody in Africa, uses Google and things like that. And Google products and Microsoft software and things like that. And in terms of hardware, we basically, our ICT is basically Chinese in terms of hardware infrastructure. So I think if we looking at it, we have to navigate these different kind of actors and their influences and what they bring to the table. And given that our digital industries are, quite infantile, for lack of a better word, we are not in a position to really kind of be very picky, or can't really, throw our weight around, because we need to develop, the pace, the way the fourth industrial revolution's unfolding. We can't really, choose sides. We have to kind of position ourselves or with the best kind of deals or products or whatever's kind of, I think, fair, reasonable, and works best for Africa's digital development has to be taken into consideration. And again, I think we're all going to come down to this point of kind of legislation, either at a continental or regional level, that works in our favor and ensures that, our kind of national security is protected and things like that. Takes into consideration citizens' data usage, citizens' digital kind of identifications and things. So I think, that's what I have to say on it. And I think we all kind of converge on the agreeing that the kind of African legislation, African kind of thought around digital legislation is really key in terms of navigating these various actors.
Yeah, and so on that point, Bob, to what extent will African countries be able to coordinate on legislation, right? So one, obviously the to-do list has a lot of things. Digital security probably, isn't always top of mind unless, you're trying to do surveillance, which you already have, since Huawei has already sold you, access to people's phones and everything. And so to what extent are African governments, thinking that this is a priority question? And secondly, if they are, what are the possibilities for coordination, whether at a regional economic community level, or perhaps even at a continental level, maybe, through the AFCFTA?
No, I think it will be, let's start by saying there's some action that is happening. Rather than start by, saying that African countries have no capacity, have no interest, very low level, one must recognize, for example, the 2020 Africa Union ICT strategy, which, sets out a couple of benchmarks that can be adopted by regional economic communities and countries. I think it starts the continent on a good level at the AU level, for example. And again, although African countries are often invited into relations with the US and China, including on matters digital technologies, at least they get an opportunity. So for example, the upcoming FOCAC, and in fact, we looked at the 2021 FOCAC that was held in Dakar, Senegal. There's quite a lot. The sections on economics had lots to do with the digital economy, and so African countries, particularly ministers of finance and ministers of information and communication, and their bureaucrats or officials will have had the opportunity to engage with their Chinese colleagues. And when I think what we saw with the US Africa Leaders Summit in December of 2022, again, of course, we ended up saying there was very little African agency and so forth, but at least the US side that offered an opportunity for engagement, which actually then provides an opportunity for African diplomats, including ambassadors in places like Washington, DC, to undertake that. But having said all that, I think it's on the question of coordination, it becomes a challenge. Even though there are opportunities, it becomes a challenge when you look at the types of regimes we have on the continent. So if you are in a place like Zimbabwe or Uganda, or to some extent Mozambique, or to this military junta, Niger, Burkina Faso, and so forth, you will not be persuaded to coordinate if the basis of your coordination is good governance, respect for human rights, and so forth. If you are attempting to steal an election and you want to knock off the internet at some point, then you will not agree to a set of principles that adhere to good governance, whatever. But if you're in a country, I think I'll mention Ghana, although Ghana, Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, to some extent, they're not perfect democracies. But at least in those countries, if you knock off the internet or you use digital technologies to steal an election, you're going to be in quite some quandary. You're going to be in some trouble. So I think in a nutshell, one can say, and I think, in fact, Ken, if you look at the laws that have been enacted in places like Uganda, where there was even an attempt to tax social media, in places like Zimbabwe, which has been held up as one country where the ICT and digital technology laws start to ape and mirror those from the PRC and so forth. You can also almost then say coordination between countries that are considered illiberal, that are authoritarian, is going to be very difficult. With those where civil society is vibrant, where there's always change of leadership based on electioneering and so forth. So I think where effort needs to be put, perhaps, is to increase African agency for coordination, rather than looking at which power is doing on the continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Yeah, and it's again, to remind everyone, right? It's hard to coordinate within a dozen countries, and it gets harder when you're thinking of 54 countries with varying sort of regime types and interests. So just a quick reminder to our audience, you can send us your questions in the Q&A. I'll be reading them out in a minute, but before that, I'd like to do something unusual, which is ask our panelists to also raise questions to each other. And so, I'll start with you, Seyram, to sort of ask you, perhaps, have you tell us what are we missing in this discussion, right? Because part of the reason why it's lovely to have you on the panel is that often we talk about this from government policy perspective, the high level politics, but never from the consumer perspective. So maybe you can tell us some of the often ignored things about digital technologies in Africa, and if you have any questions for any of the panelists, please let us know.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, some of the things I had in mind have been covered already. For instance, in the need for, or sort of the importance of a coordinated regulation. Let's put it that way, right? The reason why, and Bob has already gone over this, so I won't repeat it. But it is an important point that is worth talking about in terms of coordinating regulation across maybe regions, right? So if on the continental level it's difficult, they can perhaps ECOWAS, COMESA, that can be the starting point, and then you kind of build on that. But one of the things that I think are also overlooked is the role of African expertise at various levels, not just at governmental level. So a lot of my work has been with African tech entrepreneurs, and I know that there is this perception that there is an overhyping of African tech in a way, whether it's Silicon Savannah or whatever the names are, but there is actually incredible talent and skill sets embedded in that space, whether it's technical skills or entrepreneurial skills, right? And it's really fascinating because you can sort of also see some countries, perhaps, I don't know if this is deliberate, but there's this trend of sending African students to China to learn various things, or the Chinese government sort of admitting African students in certain sectors. But there's an even longer history of African students going all over the world and the West. And since the 1990s, a significant number of those African expertise have returned to the continent and have been working in tech in many ways, right? And so from whether it's the Ghanaian techies or the Kenyan techies, so sort of looking for expertise and skill sets within the continent is crucial at policy-making levels, at entrepreneurial levels, all of those things, because African governments like to pay foreign entities to do things that their own people can do. And so that is something that I think is critical and crucial to highlight. Another overlooked aspect is sort of the interconnections between some of the popular topics of discussion, which is like infrastructure and mineral extraction. The digital is very material. So you can't separate talk of digital space from the mining of cobalt in the DRC, and the fact that U.S. Judiciary system is more or less exonerating big tech, from Google to Apple, from the harms perpetuated on African miners, whether it's the cruisers going into the earth to mine cobalt. So the challenges we're having on the environmental, whether it's through gold, cobalt, or whatever it is, are very much connected to the incredible appetite and desire for cloud services. The cloud is not in the cloud. It is on servers that are located on land. It relies on servers built out of plastic. And the EV revolution, all of the things that we're hyping about, require lithium batteries, or production of which is not possible without cobalt and other things that are coming from the earth that is in Africa. And so one overlooked aspect is the interconnectedness between the various levels, the things that we're concerned about between the three regions that we're talking about, China, Africa, and the US. The main thing is that both of these places really need and rely on Africa, as always, for a lot of the things that will make those things work that they then sell back to us. So I think when we talk about increasing capacity and sort of relying on African expertise, it is to make sure that it's not that continued extractive relationship of exchanging raw materials and products for finished goods and products, and that we could turn some of this connection between the regions by also looking at African expertise, whether it's young tech entrepreneurs or African scholars that are still thrown all over the world, but we really have that capacity and really need to tap into that. So that's one area. I don't have any specific questions for the others because I think we don't have too much time, but I do want to highlight that in this, Yoon has talked about this, but kind of having a working group on these matters within the CAAC and other networks. I think some of us here routinely think about these questions, and so I think making this a longer term group that meets, I'm given an offer of like how to continue this conversation in a more sustained effort, I think, and presenting some of our work as a united front to maybe the AU, as we've done Mandira when we went last minute in Addis Ababa, will be really helpful in building that capacity that I'm talking about. Yeah.
That's a great point, and that's something that Yoon is championing, helping coordinate. And we'll be doing a lot more over the next year and a half here at the Africa-China Initiative at Georgetown. So watch this space. Any other questions? I already have questions in the Q&A here coming in, but any of the panelists with a question? Henry, I see your hand up.
Sorry, and I see Mandira's mic's off, so Mandira can go first if she.
I think it's more of a comment, if that's allowed. I think a lot of I've read quite a few articles, especially from Western journalists, commentators, and things, talking about or taking this position. I'd say that China is promoting digital authoritarianism in Africa, You know, they often draw on the Huawei, the case, I think it was Uganda and Zimbabwe, where Huawei workers were helping government to spy on political oppositions and things. And I think, you know, this narrative that, especially the kind of looking at it like China's pushing digital authoritarianism into the continent is quite, it's a very kind of oversimplified narrative, and it really needs a case specific case and I think country specific approach. And I think we need to acknowledge that, you know, the role of African agency and how these kind of surveillance technologies and kind of tools are kind of used. So I think, yes, you know, China does, through kind of party exchanges and things like that with African parties, present its kind of model of digital sovereignty, but it's not forcing African countries to adopt it. You know, African countries and individuals are acting of their own volition in adopting kind of digital authoritarian practices. And I think by kind of only zoning in on China, we kind of run the risk of oversimplifying a complex environment and overlooking the role of other surveillance and spyware exporters to the region. So I think I'd like to, you know, whenever you read kind of an article that takes that angle, is to just keep in mind, you know, what was the role of African agency in this case, or in a specific case. Because, you know, at the end of the day, it's our kind of governments and leaders agreeing to buy surveillance technology, and how they use it. It's really, you know, it's more the agency around how it's used. Some use it, yes, specifically for security purposes, while others are using it more for more nefarious, I'd say, endeavors, so to speak.
Yeah, thank you. Henry, and then Bob, and then I have a bunch of questions in the Q&A that I'll try and group together so that we're within the time.
Sure. I have a question for Bob. We were talking, Bob was talking about obviously the importance of the legislation and the harmonization of legislation to enforce. South Africa is obviously ground zero for a lot of this stuff, because it hosts more well, it's the only country that hosts any availability zones of any of these big cloud service providers, be it Huawei, Google, Microsoft, etc. I.e. the data centers that are owned and controlled by those companies. Are you seeing the development of much auditing expertise and legal teams in South Africa to basically hold the Googles and the Huaweis and everyone accountable, to make sure that there's no leaking of data over borders? You know, is the South African government hiring more people? Universities training more people to be more forensic on holding people accountable? I throw that out there, but I appreciate it's quite a specific question, so no worries if there's another way of tackling it.
All right, over to you, Bob. Maybe you can answer that and raise any other point that you have, so that we can open it up to Q&A.
Okay, no, thanks, Henry. That's a curveball, but I'll try and answer it as well as I can. And I think this actually leads to what Seyram was saying earlier in some form or shape, that expertise on the continent, South Africa included, is actually on the rise. But I think it has, this kind of response has to be qualified. I've undertaken a couple of interviews, interestingly, including at the Huawei data center north of Johannesburg. And what they have told me is that there's actually a shortage of expertise in certain engineering aspects. I think we can talk of development of apps and so forth, but when we get to data center, high level, you know, engineering skills, they are very scarce. In fact, I've also heard from colleagues from IBM, for example, and Cisco, which actually have installations on campuses such as WITS, specifically mentioned that where you have the highest level of electric engineers, for example, electric engineers who are actually critical to this, is actually outside of the continent. So, for example, when they want to build data centers, this is actually from a Huawei, CFO, who mentions that when they want top-level engineers, they'd rather hire South Africans, but they're just simply not there. And I think he goes on to say that, in fact, countries such as Egypt have a higher level of expertise. And when you come to countries like Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, most of these skills are not actually in place, as it were. And I think this then puts to question the idea of implementation of the laws that you mentioned earlier. One of those laws is the privacy. Is called POPI here, is private information sharing kind of information. Because if you do not have the expertise to monitor, then you're not going to be able to look at the leaks and so forth. And I think Henry will catch up on the sidelines or separately to discuss this. But my question to my colleagues, and any one of them can respond to it, is almost a geopolitical ideological question, which is that the Americans and the West more broadly are targeting China because China is rising pretty fast. And we are in a zero-sum game. We must tame the Chinese by all means. They have become the highest the electric vehicles in China is almost like a child's play these days. Their levels of tech, entry into chip making, microprocessors, artificial intelligence is threatening us. We are losing power. And so the only reason we are setting up, legal frameworks like the one mentioned in the questions, the only reason we are increasing issues of research and advocacy against Chinese laws is we must tame the Chinese in Africa because they are on the cusp of attacking us. So that in Washington, D.C., there's almost a shrill voice of some kind of fear of the Chinese. Do you think this is a good supposition? And this is my question to the panelists. Thank you. My colleagues, yeah.
Well, if I can take my moderator, put my moderator hat on and grab a bit of the question. I think it's an interesting question, right? Which should give us pause about the things to worry about. I think Mandira made this point, and Sarah as well. The things we should worry about, and the things that are overblown when it comes to China in Africa, and at the same time, I think the U.S. constantly pointing the finger at China distracts from the fact that American farms and the American state itself cooperates with African governments in doing the bad things that they accuse the Chinese of doing. So if you're in Uganda, yes, Huawei might help with the surveillance, but the police doing the arresting, the military is doing the torturing, all trained, often funded and armed by America, right? So there's a lot of complexity in sort of the problems that we tend to see with regard to China, which I guess forces us all to think about African agency, right? We're more likely to move ahead if we see presidents in African capitals as being agents in their own right, making choices often in tight corners, but their own choices nonetheless, and try and see things from that perspective. And definitely, not be distracted by the shrill voice, as you put it, coming out of DC and Brussels and other such places. So there's a related question here, which I'll also throw out for anyone willing to answer Bob's question. So to what extent does China or Huawei, for that matter, only build data centers in countries that have strong ties to Beijing, or are they willing to do business everywhere, depending on market access? And similarly, now that the US is banning or is trying to ban TikTok, what will this mean for the global architecture of data access? Are we moving in the direction of more closed systems, whereby even the US will stop advocating for super open systems and sort of try and wall off certain parts of the internet to the free world, and sort of keep the non-free world, as it were, out. Any takers?
I can start and others can jump in. So and the Huawei, I don't study Huawei directly, so I know, Henry, you've done some work on that, so folks can pitch in on that. But as far as I can tell, I don't know that it necessarily relies on having a close relationship to the PRC, or as a requirement to do business. I think it's kind of a free-for-all, if you will. Enter what markets you can, global domination, et cetera, if you want to be dramatic about it. And it's certainly in China's interest to have Chinese tech everywhere. But the reality is that this is already the case. And so from my perspective, the narrative, and this might sort of also address some of Bob's thoughts as this, is that the narrative about maybe decoupling from China is convenient and strategic in many ways. TikTok is an easy target. It's much more difficult to really decouple from China in any shape or form, whether it's in 5G infrastructure or chip making. What it might do is push China in increasing capacity in places that they were reliant on the US from. That we've seen that happening with the chip manufacturing, right? But it's not it's not an easy process. It's not a short-term process. Maybe I don't know, I'm not a soothsayer, but in the immediate sense, it's really difficult. And I say this because the commercial interest, the massive commercial interest between, say, Silicon Valley and Shenzhen, and the ways that global production function is fragmented but also entangled, is really incredibly difficult, right? During the Trump years, there was an attempt to do this by moving, say, Foxconn to Wisconsin, and a Foxconn factory to Wisconsin, in an attempt to show that maybe you can produce hardware in the United States. What happened with that? It failed totally on multiple levels, right? Because economically, it doesn't make a lot of sense to try and manufacture things in a part of the United States where that shareholders want the lowest cost in China, right? Or in these cases in Vietnam. And so the way that the global economy works makes it incredibly difficult. It doesn't mean that if you have motivated actors, you can kind of shape and reshift some of these things. And we've seen, again, that happening, especially with chip making. So it's possible, but that's sort of like the complexity of it all is kind of where I'm trying to draw attention to, that there's political convenience and in pushing a particular discourse, which will yield dividends in the near future. But currently, it's much too embedded and complicated for that to be realistic, at least in the short to medium term. But for sure, it will work out. But yeah, maybe folks can talk about whether or not Chinese investments are tied to relationships to Beijing. My sense is that that's not quite a prerequisite. But yeah.
And I guess, Henry, you can jump in here with a quick add-on here, which is, does the US stand the risk of pushing everyone who's not, the EU into China's arms, right? So it's the Chinese who are willing to do business in the region. They have the capacity, they have the right price. They're better at coordinating with African governments, and not just authoritarian governments, right? Even the nominal democratic governments. They're just better at doing business with people who are not, the EU. And so if the US takes a hard stance here, does it risk losing market share for American firms into the future?
Yeah, so okay, that's a lot. So I'm going to start with the first part of the question, and I'll hope it indirectly answers the second part of the question simultaneously. But I think actually obviously the US threat perception of Chinese tech in Africa is real. That they're obviously concerned about Chinese tech taking over markets where they may have market interests or strategic interests, and it's part of this big geopolitical mess right now. But I think that they are also fundamentally often misunderstanding or just misunderstanding how Chinese financing or market entry works, especially in this sector. And I think it really goes to the point that you were alluding to at the beginning, which is that for the most part, China will sell wherever it can because it needs to, right? It's not like these loans are not intended for the development of the country where they are going. You know, great if it also leads to some side benefits, but it's fundamentally about exporting Chinese goods and services, and they will sell those goods and services to any country that will buy it. Now, yes, there are also some countries that are perhaps more strategically important for various reasons, like Angola in the post-Civil War era, or Venezuela in the early 2000s. You know, there are countries that pop up where you certainly get a sense that they get more lending, and perhaps there's a demand factor there. But I don't think we should underestimate the fact that this is primarily supply driven. This is primarily about, you know, China needs to sell. The China Exim Bank is not a development bank. It's not the World Bank. It's not the AIIB. It is an export-import bank. Every country has one. It's just that China's is on steroids. And so when the US sees this and says, oh my gosh, every loan is strategic and every loan needs countervailing, you know, how do we create institutions to counter that? I think that is doomed to fail, because it is trying to counter a much greater force that is rooted in China's domestic economy, i.e. the need to sell because they don't have enough demand internally, and so they need to artificially create demand externally, with a strategic goal which is based around, you know, security interests and security needs. So you know, the US is going to keep trying to identify the, you know, 3 or 4 instances that may be more strategically driven, but the reality is that a lot of in particular Huawei success is based on the fact that it will get lending to go anywhere, to sell anywhere. But I would caveat this whole point by saying that's why I think it's really important to look at the distinction between Chinese firms and between Chinese actors. Because when you look at Alibaba and Tencent, they behave a lot more similarly to the Western firms, which is to say that they are entering African markets very carefully. They are primarily focused on where do we legitimately think that we can make a profit, because we cannot fall back on Chinese government lending. Basically, we can't fall back on Chinese government support in the same way, and so that makes a difference in those calculations. So I'll leave it there for now.
So Indira and Bob, I'll give you a minute each. Indira, on BRICS, does BRICS provide any sort of platform for China to amplify its influence in the region on the digital and tech space? And if so, how?
I think the BRICS is an interesting one, especially now with the BRICS Plus. You know, we have Ethiopia, the likes of Iran and Saudi Arabia, as well as, you know, democracies like India, Brazil, and then we've got Russia, and then of course South Africa, which is another democracy. In theory, at least, you know, when I say democracies, I say in theory we try to be. So it's I don't think, you know, China holds quite a bit of weight in BRICS. I don't think its kind of digital models or digital sovereignty will be so seriously challenged in BRICS, especially because having been in a few BRICS organized events, it seems that everyone kind of toes the line in terms of respecting each country's kind of sovereignty and the way each member country kind of conducts its business and governance, and so to speak. I think the message that would kind of, keeping in mind these, you know, diverse regimes and countries that are part of BRICS, I think the overall message that BRICS would probably put out is respect for digital sovereignty and how each country interprets that and practices it, and to so in that regard, I don't think China's kind of digital model will be impacted, and I don't think the countries that are members of BRICS will really look to challenge the Chinese digital presence in Africa's ICT infrastructure development. One being because they don't have really, I think, the capital to do so in terms of lending. So I don't foresee, overall, I don't foresee BRICS really, in a way, posing much of a challenge really to China.
Thank you. Yeah. And Bob, finally, as Sarah already mentioned in responding to one of the questions here, influence is not just in building data centers and selling phones, it's also in setting standards. To what extent do you see official African governments being able to sort of go toe-to-toe with China in trying to influence, the setting of standards? Yes, they care about surveillance domestically and the commercial interests that come with that. But to what extent are they able to come up with standards? The current world order, right, has standards which are super beneficial to the people who wrote them. It makes sense that the new players on the stage are interested in rewriting the rules. To what extent will African governments have some say in the rewriting of rules?
No, I don't think because we don't have much time. I'll go straight to to respond that African countries, for now and for the foreseeable future, will not have really a major impact in being norm setters, in being changers of rules in the UN system, for example, or in their relations with China or the US, or in fact, any other power. And I think it cycles back to the very simple reason that if you are the receiver, you have very little wiggle room in setting the standards. I think there's more nuance to this, but I can see we run out of time. But it's essentially to say, if you look at the AU ICT strategy document that came out 2020, it has those rules. It's been around 4 years now. It hasn't gone much. In fact, these rules were set out by the AU 2020. They look very progressive and so forth in terms of data protection, privacy, and so forth and so on. But a year later, we had FOCAC, which didn't mention any one of those standards, meaning that they were not lobbied there. And in fact, as we speak, we have this summit of the future happening in September. That aspects of digital governance fall in there. Every region has come up with a set of rules they want to see, fixed into the draft that is now circulating. You haven't seen any from the AU up to this point in time. So I think I'm not very optimistic about that, but I'll end there. Thank you.
Well, on that note, thank you, panelists. We could go on for a while. This has been wonderful. I learned so much, and I hope that our audience also learned as much as I did. And with that, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Seyram, Henry, Bob, Mandira, and Ken, our moderator, for shepherding the conversation. There were so many terms and issues that I know for some of us who aren't in this field have learned today about geotech wars, digital versus tech, digital sovereignty, and about the kind of different players involved. So I thank you for opening up this conversation. And I say that specifically because, as Ken mentioned, the China Initiative has just recently launched a research working group, and at our first meeting just yesterday, we're very excited to bring in outside experts from this small research working group, including Seyram, Henry, Bob, especially for your kind of knowledge and to kind of participate in a more vibrant kind of discussion of these very complicated and relatively new conversations we're having, particularly about the role of African actors in these engagements. So thank you again very much. I wanted to also say thank you quickly to our ACI event co-sponsors, the Initiative for U.S.-China Dialogue on Global Issues, as well as Howard University's African Studies Center, and a special thanks to Eleanor Albert of the U.S.-China Dialogue and our own Brennan, without whom we can't actually run these webinars. We have 3 more events actually coming up in the spring. So keep your eyes posted on this space. We have a book event featuring Jody Sun's new book on Kenya's and Zambia's relationship with China from the 1940s to the present. We actually have a special conversation in person with Professor Li Xiaoyang from the China Agricultural University. He'll be with us in Washington, D.C. In mid-April. And then at the end of April, we have a half-day symposium looking kind of broadening out the focus from China and Africa to include Asia, Latin America, and Americas, and to look at interconnections and flows between these different regions. So please keep your eyes posted. If you're not on our mailing list, please contact us and we'll be happy to add you. Thank you again for all of your attention and for joining us. And thanks again to the panelists.